Hello, welcome. All right, so we have the 7100 class at Delta. Hi, Rasan. All right, so let's see here. Have Celine, have Angela Nguyen, and Kim Nguyen. All right, let's see who else we have. Asif, nice to have you. Mahmoud. And Rhonda Alvarez. All right, who else? I have Seth M. Good, good. I have Yvette Brito. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven. And then I make 8. All right, great. I have all 7 of you. Nice to have you. All right, and so this week, you guys have the Antebellum West, right? Antebellum just means before the war. So the few decades, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s before the Civil War. All right, and so what you're looking at here is uh, a famous thesis on the West by a gentleman named Frederick Jackson Turner. Okay, and so I try to support his thesis on the first one, right? Let's see here. Sorry to interrupt, but then Stephanie's son. Make sure everyone gets extra credit. Who's here? All right, good, good. And so with this thesis, right? It's the notion that what makes America special, what constitutes our identity, is meritocracy, and that is that you rise or fall by merit, by how hard you work, by how talented you are, and that we're all about competition, and to the winner goes the spoils. All right, that kind of notion of equity or fairness can be seen in a lot of the writings of the founding fathers, and under a large premise under capitalism in the works of Adam Smith. But at any rate, getting into this, right? He contends that the West helps secure that it helps secure Americana. It helps secure meritocracy, right? That it wasn't really working in the East because by the historical accounts in the colonial time period, the colonial charter leaders of the joint stock companies and other, you had royal colonies and also proprietary colonies, that they with possible exception of William Penn, they didn't pretend that that was one of their goals, was to try to establish equality of opportunity for everybody. That's a modern notion being put upon an early modern, coming out of the medieval time period generation. But he says, so the East Coast, it wasn't necessarily that way, but the West helped secure this reign of meritocracy in America, and made that what we're all about, supposedly. So it's a romantic thesis, right? The West helped secure that. And the two broad categories that I think you'll find it in are equality of danger and equality of opportunity being afforded in the West, right? So you look for evidence that I try to put forth in support of his thesis as far as dangers and heading out to the West, and you should run across several. So just the trips themselves, as far as the large numbers of disease, of accidents, cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery were pretty prevalent. Accidents were written down quite often and cited. Native American attacks with the Native Americans, right, as you saw in the War of 1812, before and after the War of 1812, is there was kind of a divide and conquer tactic by a lot of the territorial governors put in their regions, private individuals, and as well as the federal government at times, whereby if the rightful leaders did not consent to a treaty, especially selling land, they oftentimes would bribe those who were willing to do such. And that's why you're going to literally have divisions within the tribes between those who were willing to touch the white man's pen and those who were unwilling to do so. And of course, those unwilling to do so, feeling as if those who had done so had sold out their own people, had become nothing less than traitors. And you had generational differences that would tended to be a pattern. Oftentimes, the younger warriors were less apt to acquiesce or to okay to treaties with the paleface, with the white man. And so, at any rate, even when you do have treaties, like later on the Medicine Lodge Treaty, the Fort Laramie treaties, whereby they give permission for white settlers to pass through their Native American tribal lands, that doesn't mean that everyone in the tribe gave his or her okay to that, right? And so certain tribes gained a notorious reputation for being intolerant of white settlers passing through their lands. And so you had the Shoshone and the Crow developed a reputation for extorting people, for stopping them in the pass of the mountain passes of like the Sierra Nevada, and demanding, some of their goods, whatever they had that they coveted, or that they threatened to shoot and kill them, kill them on the spot. Um, the certain tribes up into the Northwest. I mean, you had as early as, just after Lewis and Clark, Robert Lewis and his people on these other trips. They wrote that they stayed away from the mountain ranges of Montana and Wyoming and going into the Dakotas because of the Blackfeet and the other tribes that were there who tended to attack them immediately, right? And then not to mention just the ecosystems could be beautiful, but they could be brutal. Robert Stewart's famous trip, that some of the men drank their own urine, and at one time even dabbled with pulling sticks as to see who they would kill first and eat. So such was their hunger. And so, you went through some harsh ecosystems going across the far west. And so, of course, you have the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, and you have the Great Basin between them. You had treacherous rivers like the Platte, the Columbia, and the Snake Rivers. And so there were plenty of things that could happen, not to mention attacks by wild animals, et cetera, et cetera. So you have evidence of dangers inherent in the overland trips to the far west, the Oregon Trail, most famously, right? The Santa Fe Trail. Along the Santa Fe, by the way, the Comanche, the Apache, the Navajo, statistically attacked very often, at least as far as press coverage of such. And then you have the fact of momentary uh, time periods of virtual anarchy, of virtually no actual governing institutions in that territory, right? We were supposed to follow from our Confederation days the Northwest ordinances. And it's a very methodical process that's supposed to be followed. And land surveyors come out and they put everything out into 6 square acre plots. And then they allot how many of those will constitute how many cities, counties, and what will constitute a future state. And they put it up for private auction, and then they organize municipal governments, etc. Right? But instead of doing that, Polk, knowing that a lot of pueblos had already been established by the Spanish and later Mexican governments, he said, basically, to the victor go the spoils, and he relinquished as president of the federal government any subterranean rights to the gold found in California. So he says basically he created a rat race and said it's there for the taking. And it wasn't just the gold that was there for the taking; it was the land, etc. Right? And we see that on number two with the Latino community. But at any rate, when they came in, they there were like in the up 108 today, up into the gold mining towns, right? They weren't chartered yet. They didn't have a city council and mayor. They didn't have a police department or sheriff's office, etc. And so Anglo and Hispanic and other miners would flood in there, and altercations ensued. I mean, something as simple as you putting down a shovel and your hat on top of it to formally or informally claim a mine, and then 5 dozen guys come in well armed on horses and say, "Get out! We don't recognize that shovel and hat." And so claim jumping, all kinds of stuff happened, right? And you had a Mexican California newspapers, right? The Alta California and others that give testimony to the alleged lawlessness of the gold rush era. You find this in the famous book, The World Rushed In, by J.S. Holiday. Another pretty good book on that is by H.W. Brands on the gold rush. And so you find primary source evidence of this, of alleged lawlessness in the mines. Um, and then, that's just the mining counties of California. And so in other areas throughout the far west that was taken from Mexico, you had areas like, Baxter and Caldwell in New Mexico, whereby they were tired of outside cowboys coming in and wreaking havoc on the town. So they deputized everyone in the town to fight back and to shoot upon discretion these cowboys that came in. As late as the 1890s, you had vigilantism in the West. A famous case with the Shirley Gang, who tried to come into Meeker, Colorado, and rob a bank, and a guy named Hugus across the street from the bank, as it was being robbed, began divvying out his rifles and gave them to women as well. And they took care of the Shirley Gang before they could make it out of town. And so you have vigilantism and literally lack of law enforcement in some of the areas. You had deputies and marshals who were sent from Oklahoma all the way into the far west, and you had some infamous judges who sent them on quests where they actually put this on paper, that the given people on this list are so their names are so prevalent that chances are they're more likely than not guilty of these heinous accusations. And so if they resist you, just shoot them on the spot and don't even worry about due process. And so those kind of Wild West, that Wild West motif, of course, they take things out of context. They exaggerate numbers. There's a guy named Metz, Carl Metz, who writes a book and says that the murder rate and the gunfighting rate wasn't any higher in the West than it was on the East Coast, and perhaps that's true. But like I said, you definitely had areas in which there was no law. There was no law and order, and you have reported cases of people taking advantage of that in criminal activity. And so if you want to look for evidence of dangers that resided in the West, and remember the heart of it, right, is that these dangers, a couple things to the heart of it, is one is that the dangers were indiscriminate, right? That it didn't matter what your last name was. It didn't matter what your family background was on the East Coast. It didn't matter how much money you had with you, that you could die of cholera or dysentery or a Native American attack or from rowdy miners or cowboys, just the same as anybody else. If you found yourself in the far West in the mid to late 1800s. And so, And then the second part of the dangers, right, is it romanticizes the result, right? That's a part of the American, self perception for a long time as well. Is that we like to think of ourselves as hardworking. We work hard in order to play hard, and so when we um, it's not the American way. It's not in line with this thesis. It's not in line with the rhetoric of the founding fathers to boast and say, my father was filthy rich and he granted me all these riches. Of course not, right? But like with the Jacksonian period, right? The whole idea of the self made man is what is more impressive in American cultural traditions is to state that I was born with almost nothing, but I made it. I became rich, right? I I achieved the American dream. It's okay, Chevy Cecil. Thank you for letting us know. I'll write your name down. Okay. Um, so at any rate, let's see here. Pardon me. And so that also is added to his romanticized thesis here is that you had to be lucky, you had to be hardworking to survive, much less thrive in the West, right? And then the second component to it are opportunities. And remember again, at the heart of it is that these opportunities ought to have been relatively equitable, equally available for everybody, right? And the first one I think of in the West, or the first two I think of really, the primary ones are land, right? Because remember, by the 1830s, we began deviating from English common law and really granting squatters' rights a lot of benefit of the doubt in court decisions, right? Land that was not occupied at the time by anyone, not claimed at the time by anyone, but actually I take that back. It would be claimed oftentimes by someone, but yet that person was not improving it, right? And there were a myriad of degrees to which the judge could empathize with the squatter. The person could say, okay, well, since you have improved it, I'm going to do something close to eminent domain and I'm going to make this person sell that portion of his or her land to you, right? But you're going to buy it at market price, and everything from that as a minor concession to downright confiscation and claiming that it now belonged to the squatters. And you see that in number two, right, with Latino community, as they were not able to always sufficiently prove in a court, uh, not necessarily their ownership of their lands, but at least the extent to the boundaries to which they claimed they owned their land, right? And so they would oftentimes be the squatters would come upon and encroach upon their territories, and like moths eating little bits at a piece from clothing, right, from a t-shirt, they began gobbling up parcels here and parcels there of these big ranches and farms owned by the Latino owners. So at any rate, you have squatting rights that are available. And then later on, when you get into your history 17B, they'll mention, and although it falls within the chronology of this class, in 1862 and 3, they established a Homestead Act, and they actually granted 150 acres for free, or 160 acres for free to people who would claim it, uh, swear allegiance to the federal government because they were in the midst of a civil war, and improve it and stay upon it for at least 5 years. And so there were there were opportunities for land for people, right? Now, needless to say, if you had lots of money and were a land speculator and didn't even plan on moving to Arizona or wherever it might be, but simply wanted to wait until the land survey office got there or until the railroads divvied it out and offered their lands for sale, that they were granted by the federal government. And that's a whole other can of worms, subsidizing the railroads. But their government given lands, they sold for profit. And if you were wealthy, you could buy more land, obviously. You could buy land that you never even moved upon and just waited for it to develop, especially for towns along the railroad tracks to develop. And the profit, the value of it would skyrocket. And then you sell it for profit, right? Land speculation. So land speculators clearly could make a killing in the West. Corporate miners and ranchers who had the expensive farm equipment, right, could engage in economies of scale and just outproduce their smaller competitors. Big corporate ranchers could hire more ranch hands to capture more cattle, because clear back to 1540 with Vasquez de Coronado, there had been a roaming cattle um, and as well as bison population in the West. And Rutherford B. Hayes administration and others had given a tacit okay that if it's not branded, it's for the taking. And so, if you were wealthy, you could have more hands available to capture more cattle, buy more land, then used your barbed wire fence to barbed wire it all up, get inside information as far as where the railroad tracks were going and get close to a railroad depot to ship your produce to the east. And so, like anywhere, right, you could definitely make the argument that it still was easier if you were rich, right? And he, of course, so that kind of runs counter to this thesis. So he doesn't notice I don't mention any of that in this number, right? But he wants to focus on the areas in which the common person had a fighting chance here into the West, right? And so, in addition to land, right, although people would disagree with what I said on land, what I left out was the fact that in our textbook, and he's not necessarily, or he's not a Marxist historian, even Alan Brinkley, who seems to be kind of a intermediate, middle of the road historian in his historiography, he states that the average person was too poor to move along the Oregon Trail into the West, because you had to have so much money to survive and make it across that trip. Then even if you came across free land, unless you just suddenly became a subsistence farmer and growing your own food, even then that would take a while. If you became a cash crop farmer chasing after that American dream, where were you going to get money for the feed and to wait for the harvest and the tools, etc.? And so, at any rate, like I said, there are definitely, especially having over 100 years to dissect this thesis, there are some holes in it. But it's very famous and it's very thought provoking, I think. And so, at any rate, he focuses upon areas in which people could squat on land, the mineral rushes. If you look again at the Mexican newspapers in 1848, the first people that got there, supposedly they contended in the newspaper accounts, it did not require any skill. It did not require any capital, right? Any money to start with to buy machinery, etc. That it was simply a matter of panning in the rivers, in the American, the Feather, Consumnes, and other rivers, right? And so, at any rate, that might be an instance if you got there quickly enough, early to a mineral rush, that you could achieve your American dream. And then also, of course, they have a term called mining the miners, right? Like Levi Strauss, the Chinese were resented for doing such, right? Is you go into a mining territory, and instead of perhaps mining for the gold, silver, copper, whatever mineral it is, you say, you know what? I see plenty of demands of these miners. They're going to want food. They're going to want someone to wash their clothes. They're going to want entertainment. So you know what? I'm going to go ahead and offer them just that. And so hence you could mine them, right? Sam Brannan, a gentleman who came with a Mormon battalion during the Mexican-American War and was there on the famous Sutter's Ranch, where they were trying to split the American River in half to increase the strength of the current, so as to power the sawmill. And when they did that, they found gold right there in the riverbed. And Sam Brannan happened to be there, and they were supposed to keep it hushed, according to the military governor Mason, and until the president had made a decision. And of course, Sam Brannan ignored that, came into San Francisco with a jar full of gold, and told everybody, look what we have here in the gold in the hills. And what he proceeded to do very quickly was to purchase every available, and not literally, but almost, supposedly, according to the primary sources, purchase as many of the tools, the pickaxes, etc., that a miner would need to use, right, or want to use as possible. So he nearly monopolized them for the first several months. And of course, he sold them at exorbitant rates to the would-be miners. And so if you were quick on your feet enough, right, that was the second avenue to the American dream that I found, I don't know, a little bit credible in this thesis, was entrepreneurial, starting a business of some sort. According to the World Rushed In, J.S. Holiday, people who had seen the elephant, right? You've already been through the circus. You saw the elephant at the end. That was a euphemism that I've seen everything it has to offer. I'm no longer impressed. I'm going home. So those who have proverbially seen the elephant in California and began going back across the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail, um, they would have people just simply stop them and say, "Would you please send this letter of correspondence back to my family? Can you at least send it and put it in the mail in St. Louis, or one of the beginning parts of the overland trails in Missouri?" And then, of course, they would say, "Well, how, for how much are you willing to have me do this?" And they began charging people. And, something as small as 25 cents a piece back then really added up. And so you had the Mormon battalion, or before the Mormon battalion, or with Brigham Young and others, is they began manufacturing really effective source of ferrying people across the rivers. And they began charging people for such. And they made a lot of money from doing something that simple. And then, of course, you had people start cooperating with the federal government, because the federal government, from time to time and space to space, would have these intervals, like starting with the Pony Express, etc., having these forts, and they would offer supplies. They would sell them, and in some cases, they would actually give them away, supplies to the migrants and so forth. And so entrepreneurs would join those forts where they knew people were stopping to rest, and whatever kind of commodities, right, that they might need, that they might desire. If you could offer that commodity, you can make some money. So at any rate, right, that's Turner's thesis, is that the West, right, with its indiscriminate dangers and with its indiscriminate opportunities, it allowed meritocracy to be really established and reborn in the United States, a system that was fair, where it didn't matter what your background was. If you worked hard enough, if you were talented enough, and lucky enough, you could rise. Okay. And so he says that the West was integral in maintaining American meritocracy. So are there any questions about number one? All right. So let's see here. All right. Let's see here. He's gone. All right. So with number two, okay. Number two looks at poking a big hole in Turner's thesis, just simply looking at the demographic of Latinos in the U.S., right? And so what I want you to be familiar with the test and through reading here, right, are firstly like the basic facts, right? And so I want you to gain familiarity, if perhaps you already have it, of Mexico's loss of Texas, and then of California and the rest of the far west. So in 1836, right, Texas will be lost to a colony known as San Felipe de Austin, kind for in a somewhat levity type way. I'm saying a gringo colony in eastern Texas that was permitted, right, to Moses Austin, and then under Spain, and then to his son Stephen Austin under Mexico. And at that time, right, Mexico and Coahuila were united as one state. They At that time there was a liberal constitution of 1824 that was very federal. like our government, but perhaps in some ways even more so. It granted limited autonomy to the states. The states had their own governments, had their own laws. They elected their own assemblymen who wrote the laws. They elected their own governors, right? They had, except in time of war and national emergencies, they had control over their own state militia. Okay, and so a lot of that was very desirable to the demographic that tended to come into Eastern Texas. Now, amongst the gringos, right, a lot of them happen to have been second generation from their parents who had been immigrants as the Scots Irish. And I remember the Scots Irish, you got to be careful of essentialism of saying this ethnic group is like this or like that, right? Because you're gonna engage in gross simplifications, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just saying, as far as the primary sources go, during the War for Independence and just after, the Scots Irish in this country developed a reputation, right or wrong, for being rebelliously libertarian, for being fearful and hateful of any outside government, wanting to do their own thing and pursue the American dream. So remember, Andrew Jackson's parents were just that. He came from that stock and lived up to that stereotype. A lot of them, with Daniel Boone and others promoting the entrance of the Scots Irish, were encouraged to go through the Cumberland Gap of the Appalachians into Tennessee and Kentucky. Um, I kid you not, one of the Carolinas issued a decree telling the Scots Irish immigrants that they were not welcomed to just move on through their territory. You had the famous Kings Mountain episode, whereby the Scots Irish in Tennessee were told um, by the Continental Army that they were being called upon to fight for the cause of freedom against the British. And they said no, right? Because to them, everybody else, all outsiders to them, they wanted to just keep to themselves, to their own families, have their own land, etc. Right? And so they said no, thank you to George Washington, right? And the British tried to send people in to try to influence them to fight with the Tories, and they said no to them as well. And so then the Lord Dunmore, he sent in dragoon unit to fight these Scots Irish for not helping, and for also they were engaged in a strategic move in the South. But when they came into that area, they actually lost to the Scots Irish settlers, a big battle at Kings Mountain, and they received a congratulatory letter from Washington, telling them, okay, now please come fight with us. Good job, we're proud of you, etc. And they said, no, thank you, we're staying here. And George Washington said, basically, I'll deal with you later. And so the Cherokee and the Creek, right, and the Choctaw as well, they had a saying for this particular demographic that had come in. They called them the long knives. A lot of them had the famous like Jim Bowie knife, and they were not afraid to use it as far as contesting land from those tribes in that area of the Appalachians. And not to mention, you get into stereotypes of people that living in certain circumstances, including a very geographically isolated mountainous region, almost exacerbates or breeds any libertarian belief, where you become even more kind of xenophobic of everyone and everything that's considered an outsider of your region. I'm getting into all this, you guys, because this tended to be the main demographic that took Austin's offer to come in to get free land into Eastern Texas. And so to me, right, if there's any of that stereotype that sticks, it helps make a little bit of sense of how rebellious this group is going to become rather quickly. So this group comes in, right, initially just 300 of them, but by 1830, just 6 years later, they were up to 7,000. And so they received free land. I have the numbers in there, right? Over 6,000. I know it sounds kind of random, 6,338 acres or something like that. But remember, Mexico was on the metric system. And so they had a different system of computing it. But at any rate, you should see a cycle of defiance from the very beginning, right? Them having a problem with the liberal Constitution of 1824. Overall, they loved it, right? Because it was more amenable to libertarian thought because it was federal and it gave the states a lot of autonomy and to elect and have their own leaders, etc. Right? However, it outlawed slavery. So they threw a hissy fit until a compromise of some sort was sought. And I believe I wrote the compromise in there. I don't have it memorized, but I believe it was that no one could be born a slave in that colony, but if you happened to bring one, you could have one for a certain amount of time. And so it was a compromise that was set because of their stubbornness, right? Well, they were granted 6 years of tax exemption, 6 years, right? So at the seventh year in 1831, at a place called Anahuac, Anahuac, the Mexican authorities came to tax them, and they rose in rebellion. Heaven forbid they be taxed, right? They were supposed to learn Spanish, become Roman Catholic. They were encouraged to intermarry, right? Mestizaje or miscegenation with the Mexican families, with the Tejanos. And the initial 300 did, by and large, including Stephen Austin, but not the next group that had really become the majority by 1830. And so, at any rate, then, of course, you had about that time the border commission come up, right, of Mier y Terán and Sanchez. And when they came up, they had nothing but bad news to report back to Mexico City, right? They contended that the Americans are not integrating by choice. They're not paying their taxes. They're defying the slave, edicts, and they're haughty, right? And remember, haughty is that you're arrogant, and that arrogance usually coexists with defiance, right? You defy because you think you can do whatever you want. And so those are the depictions by Mieri Terán and Sanchez, right? And so Bustamante down in Mexico City had his Congress issue the April 6th colonization law of 1830. And that stated no more slavery there, more troops up there to extract tax revenue, and no more gringo immigration into eastern Texas. And so, of course, Stephen Austin protested that, right? And in defense of Stephen Austin, he had assimilated and sworn loyalty to the Mexican government when the Fredonian Revolt erupted in his colony. He squashed it. He had several instances of reports asking for more Mexican troops to help him secure law and order because he was frightened by his own colony. They were not listening to him. They had him outnumbered. They were highly armed and defiant, and he was claiming he needed Mexican help. But when it came down, right, what he thought as being a cosmopolitan, educated man, right, who he thought had demonstrated his loyalty to Mexico, he thought that he could be a conciliatory figure, a go-between, a middleman in this issue, right? So he says, regarding this April 6th law, guys, he goes, unfortunately, I think you're going to need to bring forth another type of compromise when it comes to the slaves. And I think you need to set a date to tell us when Anglos can begin coming in again from the U.S. surrounding Texas. And Gomez Farias was the president at that time, by the time he made it down there. And Gomez Farias said, basically that he would do no such thing, and that they were, according to the Constitution at that time, because Mexico will have several constitutions, said that they were a mere department of the state under the federal government's supervision. And basically he didn't need to make such concessions to them, that they didn't deserve it, that it would be rewarding poor behavior. And supposedly Stephen Austin told them, if you don't, you're going to lose Eastern Texas. They're going to rebel and you'll lose. And Gomez Farias contended that Stephen Austin had threatened treason. So he put him in jail. He put him in prison for 15 months. And during that time in prison is when he became depressed and disillusioned with the Mexican government and wrote back a secret letter to San Antonio City Council telling them, do whatever you think is best. I can't reason with them. And so now the conciliatory figure who was trying to hold back this rebellious um, population is no longer in the mix. He's out of the equation. And so it didn't take long at all for the war hawks to get a hold of public sentiment and make the major decisions for that colony, like Sam Houston, William Barrett Travis, and others. So at any rate, what noticing here, right, is the Constitution of 1835, the Siete Leyes, right, the Seven Laws Constitution of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. It was very, I put uber conservative, and it was. It treated the states as mere departments of the federal government. The governor now was to be handpicked by the president. The state legislators were to be done away with. No need for state laws. Everything would be centralized in a unitary centralized government, right? And so, of course, the libertarian-minded Anglos in Eastern Texas were not okay with this highly centralized new constitution. So that's what they formally rebelled against, right? Some of them at the Alamo had returned to the Constitution of 1824 flags with them. But what I try to cynically make the argument of it is, right, is rather than being a political fight, that it was a convenient excuse. It was a pretext, right? It was a convenient excuse to take that land from Mexico. And so at any rate, I try to give evidence of racism through the press, through the mouths of our politicians at that time period, through the behavior of our settlers and our soldiers when we did fight the Mexican-American War 10 years later. And and so like I said, I'm really doing conflict history on number 2, right? Depicting winners and losers, and I'm trying to get you to empathize with those who lost. And so looking at that, the Mexican-American War was 10 years later. So Mexico or Texas from 1836 to 1845, or the end of 44, was its own republic. The Diputación, or the Congress of Mexico, told the United States, do not even think about annexing Texas as a new state, or it will mean war with us. We'll immediately cut off diplomatic relations and mobilize our army. So not even the feisty Jackson would touch Texas. But Tyler on his way out, and Polk, another Scots-Irish Tennessee guy from the frontier who became elected president as a dark horse, he came in and made it clear he wanted Texas and he wanted California as well. And that's where you get manifest destiny and all that rhetoric, right, of saying that the Mexican people will be better off under the American flag because we're going to bring them more enlightened society. We're going to give them more political participation and freedom in their governmental system. We're going to give them more economic opportunities in our capitalist economic system, right? And we're going to bring them superior Anglo-American culture, right? And so all that stuff, right? And so so at any rate, when Congress agrees to annex Texas, Mexico begins cutting off diplomatic relations. And then to add insult to injury were 2 more things. Polk tried to purchase California, which he should have known Mexico considered an insult and would not sell for any amount of money. And also, he picked a fight, arguably, over the southern boundary of Texas, claiming that it should have been the Rio Bravo del Norte, or the Rio Grande as we know it today, right? As opposed to the Nueces, according to the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty. And so you look at the contested land between those 2 rivers, and I've read Chicano historians contending that is some of the least arable, least fertile land on the North American continent, that the land is virtually useless in and of itself, that this was just picking a fight. And so he sent American soldiers beyond the Nueces, so where Mexico considered now her own land, brought them right to the Rio Bravo del Norte, or Rio Grande. And it took about less than a week, and a skirmish ensued. And about 20 American boys were shot off their horses and killed. And of course, Polk says American blood has been shed on American soil to Congress, right? And of course, you're going to have a decent demographic of people, especially Christians, intellectuals, um, and some politicians who are going to very vocally protest this war as unjust. But when we fight the Mexican American War, it's from 1846 to 1848. We won via two routes. Zachary Taylor came in through the U.S. into Coahuila, just beneath Texas, and won some big battles there. And I could put something. I could post something if I get any requests. I could post like a narrative of the war itself as well, as far as like the major battles and so forth. Um, but at any rate, in addition to Zachary Taylor's army, the primary one was under Winfield Scott, and that came by way of the route of Cortez. Went into Veracruz and marched into Mexico City and took the capital. And so you have famous battles, the Battle of Chapultepec. You could look that up. Buena Vista, Cerro Gordo, some big battles, and by all accounts, the Mexican army fought very valiantly, but more often than not, they were disunited as far as their generals. In some cases, I kid you not, one general in a very big battle refused to help another general because of a personal tiff that they had. Another one, when they came to the surrendering Mexican troops, they said, "Hand over your ammunition and artillery." And he said, if I had ammunition and artillery, you wouldn't be standing here. So they literally ran out of bullets. And so at any rate, the Americans win, and Winfield Scott is going to begin publicly executing some of his own soldiers down by Mexico City because of the preponderance of raping the Mexican women in particular. And so he did it for several reasons, supposedly. But one of them, he contended, was just a moral obligation, feeling as if that he needed to. His religion played into it as well, and he liked to think that God was on his side and that he was going to relinquish God's favor if he let his soldiers engage in depredations against the Mexican people. But also there was a practical side that he wanted to kind of, provide a catharsis, right? Catharsis like punching a punching bag, letting people's negative emotions come out in a healthy way, that he wanted to give catharsis to the Mexican people and letting them know that the American soldiers would not get away with such. But I use it on number two, right, as further evidence of just downright racism of Anglo-America toward Latino. Or to me, Latino is primarily Spanish and indigenous mixed, right? Like the mestizo demographic. To me, Hispanic is just technically of Spain and Spanish speaking and Spanish culture. That's why I chose to use Latino instead of Hispanic in that regard. But that there you have it with number two. And then look for evidence of after the war, right? Of discrimination, not only socially and culturally and popularly by the people themselves. The Anglo miners that came in, they resented the Sinaloans and the Sonorans from Mexico, who came in and beat them to the mines and did really well. The Chileans as well was resentment toward them because they were very adept, very skillful at mining, like using quicksilver, etc., that a lot of other people didn't know to use. You have cases like the banditos, right? Like Joaquin Murrieta, Cortina, and others who contended that the popular story is that the system itself and the series of events were so unfair that was the only way they knew to respond, was to fight back against the law, like in almost kind of Robin Hood fashion. And so they call it social deviance or social banditry, right? And Joaquin Murrieta, by the way, is going to be the origin of the future story of Zorro, right? The fox. So at any rate, you have, and I tried to cite a couple of guys that I thought were really effusively gave a lot of data to back their claims. Felipe Armesto, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, and Rodolfo Acuna, and I have them cited at the bottom of the pages. Their books are very telling, and they depress you reading them. But at any rate, so with number two, you're looking at evidence, right? Of I want you to gain familiarity for the next test with the loss of Texas, the loss of Mexico, I'm sorry, the loss of California in the far west. And by the way, right during the war, if I could add this just in case I have it on the test, is during the war, John C. Fremont came in three expeditions, right? And he was for the military, wore a military uniform and everything, employed by them, subsidized by them, right? The first trip, no big deal. He had papers to prove what he was up to. The second and third trips, he didn't. And it seemed rather disconcerting to the Mexican government in California. Why have you come here a second and third time? Because it was no different on paper than from Lewis and Clark. It was a topographical survey where they were supposed to get data on animal life, plant life, trade routes, Native American tribes, and which ones are hostile and not hostile, et cetera, right? As we were looking out and scoping out and trying to purchase the West from Mexico. But when he came in, like I said, the second or third time, they arrested him momentarily, and of course they ended up releasing him. He goes up to the Oregon Territory and he meets with a guy named Archibald Gillespie. And Archibald Gillespie was a spy for the U.S. military and government. And so then what do you know? As Fremont is coming back down along the Sierra Nevada, he hears of news of the Mexican-American War breaking out. And so Mexico claims California, right? And so it was like as if, okay, all is fair in love and war. We're at war now, so now California's fair game. And before he even made it across through the Sierra Nevada back into California, a group of men who, again, a lot of them were Scots-Irish, not to throw a particular demographic under the bus, but facts are facts, came in, right? And they took the Comandante General, the leader of all the Mexican militia, was Vallejo, that Vallejo is named after, right? General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. And he was having breakfast with his kids, his daughters. And this ragtag group of guys come in, right? And there was a guy named Graham, spelled like the graham cracker. There was a nephew of Mary Todd Lincoln, who actually wrote out the bear flag itself and devised it himself. There was a guy named Ezekiel Merritt, who was one of the main ringleaders. There's another gentleman, and his name's eluding me. Of course, I'll remember as soon as the video's done. But at any rate, they came in and took him hostage under arrest, and Fremont came in and they handed him over to Fremont. So just like that, they took the top of the Mexican military. And so now under Governor Castro, he was hamstrung from the very beginning. He had a guy named Pio Pico down in L.A. Who had never recognized him as the legitimate governor, because Mexican California was pretty tumultuous in and of itself. And so I don't know if they ever really united in fighting off the American invasion, but it didn't take long from this so-called bear flag revolt of Ezekiel Merritt and these other guys and Graham. It didn't take long between that and an outright American naval and army invasion. The naval invasion came by a guy named Sloat, Sloate, who came into San Francisco and Monterey. And then you had a gentleman named Stephen Kearney, Kearney, who came all the way through New Mexico down into Southern California to fight. And then there was a guy who was rather ruthless with the LA population, and his name was Redfield Stockton. And so they're going to put the Mexican people of Los Angeles, of the city of Los Angeles, under martial law and have a curfew for them because they rose and rebelled successfully one time and they tried it a second time. Pio Pico is going to go into exile into Baja California and try to bring back an army to come back and fight the American soldiers. But by then, it was such an overwhelming loss for Mexico in Mexico itself that they gave up. They thought, what's the use? Our capital is taken over. What's our use in sending troops to California? And so, of course, California will be taken, as well as Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Idaho, parts of Wyoming and Montana. It's crazy how much land was taken from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848. And the crazy thing is gold, when gold was discovered there, right, in the American River, it was January 24th, 1848. So January 24th to February 2nd, that's what, 8 days? So gold was found literally the last 8 days of the war. And so that was a bad, an unlucky combination of events for the Californios, the ethnic Mexican Americans in California, because Anglos are going to come in by the hundreds of thousands into California for the gold rush. The famous 49ers, right, came registered, just those registered on the Oregon Trail alone, which there are 3 or 4 other popular routes, were 80,000 in 1849 alone. All right. And so anyway, you're looking and seeing, okay, in light of all this, right, was there really equality of opportunity for the Mexican American people? And of course, right, that's a rhetorical question. My answer to that on number 2 is no, right? That there wasn't equality of opportunity for Mexican Americans. Not only did they have their land stripped from them, but thereafter, there were plenty of ways by which governments and people deprived them in their quest for the American dream. All right. So any questions or comments? Any questions or comments? All right. So if there aren't, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Okay. So that's what we have for this week. We're getting toward the end, you guys. We're getting into the origins of the Civil War next week, I believe, then the Civil War itself, then Reconstruction, then the final test, and we're done. So we're getting there. Good. I hope so. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your feedback. I really appreciate that. Yeah, even just the least bit of knowledge that I'm helping anyone, even a single student, makes all this worthwhile for me. And I mean that. All right. Well, thank you. And thank you for that feedback. I really appreciate that. All right. I hope so. I hope so. All right. So you guys have a great week. And for those of you who are here today, I'm very excited and happy to give you extra credit for this. All right. So you guys have a great one. Okay. Thank you so much, you guys, for your comments. I appreciate that. That made my day. All right. Bye-bye.